The Tennessee class represented the final iteration of the 14-inch armed standard type battleships in the US Navy, but whilst progression from the Nevadas to the Tennessees appears logical and sustained, at least on the surface, it was actually anything but. Two other major design ideas repeatedly competed for attention when each year's design was being established during the heyday of the standard type design. Briefly, these were the torpedo type and the Ironsides type. The former called for an exceptionally high-speed ship with anything up to 18 torpedo tubes, and indeed even the first drafts of the previous New Mexico class had called for a broadside of 4 torpedoes, for 8 launchers in total. This had been defeated due to the massive structural and flooding weaknesses that such large torpedo rooms would entail. The Ironsides concept called for a ship whose armour scheme more closely resembled that of CSS Virginia in profile, with a few extra sponsons tacked on the outside. This had been defeated at a rather worryingly late stage when stability calculations had showed that in the event of a battle, flooding of the unarmoured areas outside of the sloped armour would lead to a ship so unstable that a heel of a mere 10 degrees, something that could be induced by medium sea state waves, would cause the ship to inevitably and rapidly capsize. Due largely to the need to finalise designs in time, but also due to Congress being extremely tight with funding, it took about 2 years to go from the start of a specific design to the laying down of the ship. Hence, Battleship 1915, the New Mexicos, started work in 1913, and Battleship 1916, the Tennessees, started in 1914. In both cases, the US Navy had actually made the case to switch to the 16-inch gun, a prototype of which was then undergoing testing. This had, however, been overruled by the then Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, who didn't want the extra cost, and so both ships would have 14-inch weapons instead. But you might ask, why am I mentioning the New Mexicos so much when we're supposed to be talking about the Tennessees? Well, because, having had its plans for a 16-inch ship rejected for Battleship 1915, the US Navy resubmitted effectively the same 16-inch ship for Battleship 1916, with a few minor changes here and there. Secretary Daniels rejected this request as well, insisting that for cost reasons, Battleship 1916 would be a repeat of Battleship 1915 with some small allowance for modifications. The US Navy would catch on to this tactic and subsequently request a design with 10 16-inch guns for the next class, then negotiating Daniels down to what would eventually become the Colorado class. But that's another video. Some of the changes in the Tennessees were built in from the start. Others were adopted because by the time they were just about to go under construction, the Battle of Jutland had been fought, and various changes from what the US Navy believed the lessons of that battle to be were incorporated. Overall, the most important changes were an enhanced torpedo defense system, the decision to switch to turboelectric propulsion following tests on USS Jupiter and USS New Mexico, albeit that some errors were made in this, as it was found when one of the 2 main generators aboard Tennessee broke down a few years into service. It was found the ship's hatches weren't actually large enough to remove the offending machinery, leaving a difficult choice as to whether to try cutting apart the machinery in place or cut open the ship itself. Additionally, the gun turrets were modified to allow higher elevations of up to 30 degrees and thus considerably longer range gunfire. A row of casement-mounted secondary guns in the hull was also deleted, as it was realised that they'd be washed out in most sea states. Overall, the ships would therefore be armed with a dozen 14-inch 50 caliber guns in 4 triple turrets, with a pair superfiring forward and a similar pair aft, with a secondary battery of 14 single 5-inch guns, 10 in casements mounted in the superstructure, and the other 4 a deck higher in open mounts. 4 single 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were carried, along with a pair of submerged torpedo tubes, with 1 per side. 28,000 shaft horsepower drove 4 screws for the standard type top speed of 21 knots, with a main armour belt again of the standard type's maximum thickness of 13.5 inches, with a variety of armoured decks with a single maximum thickness of 3.5 inches. 2 ships would be built, Tennessee and California. Although California was laid down earlier, in 1916 as opposed to 1917 for the Tennessee, both would launch in 1919, and Tennessee commissioned first in 1920, with California following in 1921. During the interwar period, a few of the secondary guns were removed to facilitate additional anti-aircraft weapons, at first more 3-inch guns, and then all the 3-inch were replaced with 5-inch 25 caliber anti-aircraft guns by the late 1920s. Aircraft launching facilities were also installed, first atop the superfiring turrets and then later all moved to the stern. Both ships would be present at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked, California being sunk and Tennessee damaged, in the latter case largely by the on-fire USS West Virginia next to her, as well as by the burning remains of other battleships around her. Thus, both ships would be rebuilt in the aftermath, although in Tennessee's case this was because fuel shortages gave them the time, resulting in completely different-looking vessels. New 5-inch 38 twin mounts, new masts, new superstructures, new torpedo defense systems, increased deck armor, and other changes including radar gave the ships a thoroughly modern appearance. Both ships would then mainly undertake bombardment and support duties during World War II, along with being present for the Battle of Surigao Strait, and would suffer under kamikaze attacks later in the war. With their beams exceeding the Panama Canal's capacity thanks to their bulged refits, they ended up heading home the long way post-war, being decommissioned shortly thereafter, but retained, just in case, until 1959, when they were sold for scrap.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.